So, okay, we're recording. How should we start out?
Well, let's edit that out right away. My name is John Koba, and I'm the city health official here in Norfolk. My office is located over in the fire division, and my direct line is 402-844-2046. Today we're just wanting to talk a little bit about bats, and particularly precautions that you might use if you encounter a bat, ways that you can deal with a bat if you come across one, and some considerations you need to take for your general health and safety. Sure, bats are, truly a beneficial creature. They consume a lot of insects. They're out in the environment in great numbers, and in most cases we never encounter them because they usually are out at night. You don't see them very well, but you probably can be aware that they're out flying around at night, capturing the insects. I've heard it said that they can eat their body weight in bugs in a night, and I couldn't say that to be true, but that's a lot of insects. So they perform a very good part of the ecosystem. And I hear a lot of times that, well, all bats are protected, and I don't know that that's true. Most of the bats we have here are big brown, little brown bats, are those species. Whether they're protected or not, though, we have to respect them as being a part of the ecosystem that we want to preserve, so we don't want to randomly dispose of bats. That being said, we don't want to be taking the fact that a bat could be harboring a disease for granted, and so we want to deal with them properly so that we don't have ourselves exposed to any diseases that they might potentially carry. Disease that comes to mind is going to be rabies, and that is a potential. Rabies is not all bats are going to have rabies, certainly. The majority of bats don't have rabies, and it's very unlikely that you would encounter a bat that has rabies. However, you have to also consider that if you are dealing with a bat, as with any other wild animal, there is the potential for that creature to have rabies, and it only becomes critical if you're either scratched or bitten by that bat or any other creature that is capable of carrying rabies. Then you have to consider precautions that you need to take to make sure that you're not unduly exposed to it. It could potentially be fatal, and so that's the reason that we need to take it seriously. Avoid exposure by avoiding being bitten or scratched. I've had occasions when I've gone into a house and we have had to deal with a bat. In most cases that bat isn't flying around at the time that we're looking for it, but if they do know where it is, or I guess the first things that we would do would be to wear gloves to protect our hands. I think long sleeve shirts are appropriate as well. Bats aren't inclined to come after you, so they're probably going to try to fly away from you as much as anything. Even if they're flying in the room, they're not going to be wanting to come into contact with you. But having the gloves and a long sleeve shirt and protecting yourself in those ways is a good step. I've had instances where I think it's a very good idea, if there is a bat flying in the room, that wherever you are, that you watch that bat to see where it lands, or if it's getting away, hiding behind something. Those are just good ways to know what your bat situation is and whether there's frequency of that bat flying into that interior space. So at that point, watching the bat, you might be able to find it in a location that you can trap it. Certainly some people use tennis rackets and whatever else they're going to flail around at to do that. I've heard of successes with that. I've heard of people knocking things over and having undue damage with that kind of a thing. And then again, I think it's better to just watch the bat, see where it's going, and then try to capture and contain it. We can use something as simple as a butter dish or any kind of a container like that. Find where the bat has landed, take that over, capture the bat behind it, and then slide something underneath that. You've got it contained in that, and I emphasize I would be wearing gloves and hopefully have long sleeve shirts at that point. But then you can remove that and get it outside and and dispose of it or send it away so that it's keeping track of whether it's bitten anybody. At that point, when it's contained, make sure that nobody has been bitten or that there's been no exposure in that manner. And if there has been no exposure and nobody's been bitten, we can dispose of the bat or let it loose and it can go away that way. So, but that's a good way to do it, and you can do that if you watch where it lands. If it lands someplace, scurries underneath a board or gets tucked away, then you need to assess how I can get that out at that point. But in most cases, I don't think that probably happens. If it does, you may have to seal those openings up, so that would be a potential at that point. Well, the good thing about bats is they don't have vampire teeth like you might see in the movies. Bats have very fine teeth. That being said, I would use a lightweight pair of gloves should work. If heavier is better, that's fine. Just use something that has a little agility with it so that you can handle whatever you're working with. But you don't have to worry about them putting an extreme bite on or anything like that. It's more of a scratch situation. So if you have a decent pair of lightweight leather gloves, that would handle it in most cases. If you've got it contained, the best thing to do is secure it, and just secure it so that it isn't going to get out of that container, and then make sure that the supervisor knows, or if you're going to be calling the health department, certainly can call our office. We would be making contact with the state of Nebraska, and they've got a number that we can call to explain the situation to them. If they feel it's appropriate, they would give us a number that would be associated with that bat and that incident, and then we could take that bat to a veterinarian's office to have it processed so that it could be submitted in. If you're on duty, certainly it's best to advise, contact your supervisor, let them know that you've encountered a bat. That would be the first step, so that would be if you actually were scratched or bitten, or if you weren't sure if you were scratched or bitten, but you thought there was a potential of that. You would want to contact your supervisor to find out what the next steps would be. That being said, you need to do a few things right in the field as you're dealing with that situation. So if you encounter a bat and it bites or scratches you, the best thing to do is to try to capture it so that you can get it considered for testing. And if you don't catch the bat and you've been scratched or bitten, the presumption is that you may have been exposed to rabies, and at that point it may go into a treatment realm where you're going to have to take the rabies shots to. I think you could, I would still let the supervisor know. I think I would still try to call for assistance with that and just get that process going. If that bat is contained, I think we can make an arrangement in most cases to get that dealt with accordingly. The state, as I say, they have a number, but I couldn't say that that's a 24-hour number, but I think that we would be able to get somebody considering that. Good point would be to contact your doctor, contact someone in the medical field, and let them know about that situation and get that process started then. The cost of that is minimal compared to the cost of being tested and being treated for a rabies exposure. At this point, we're just checking to see if that bat has rabies or not. So we can send it in. There's a minimal fee for the processing of it of $50 or something in that regard. If we don't have the bat and we're not able to submit it for testing, then you're dealing with a number that is much larger than that. It's going to be into the thousands of dollars potentially. So, but at the same time, contracting rabies is a serious thing, so we have to treat that accordingly. You hear about the good old days, if there were such a thing, that involved multiple shots into the stomach, and that's not the case anymore. At this time, there's a shot that is delivered in the area of the bite, or the area that was where the exposure happened, and then the other shots are, as I've heard described, as being more like a tetanus shot. So a shot, several shots administered somewhat as an immunization would be at that point. So not as bad as I have heard of in the past. One way that you can tell if you have bats in the house is to look for the remnants of a bat roosting, for instance. They're usually going to have a pile of guano that's underneath the spot where they roost, or you're going to see those little pellets that look like mouse droppings that might be around, and if they've flown in the room, you might see some stuck on the wall, or you might see them up on some spot where a mouse probably wouldn't have been. So if you start to detect those kind of telltale signs, that might indicate to you that you've had bats that have been flying in an area and leaving those deposits. The frequency that you might have seen a bat is going to be something to consider at that point. If somebody has a single bat first one that they've ever seen in their house, and they've lived at that house for a while, that would be something that we could perhaps consider as a bat that just made its way in, whether it came down a chimney or whatever that situation might have been. But if it's a situation where we see a couple of bats every month, or we frequently see bats, or we have them every year or every couple of years that we see bats in the house, that kind of points to a structural issue. And at that point, we want to look at the house and see if there's ways that we can exclude bats from the structure. Bats are not unlike any other creature. They're looking for shelter. They happen to find it in houses in many cases. In many cases, the houses are designed to where the bat doesn't make its way into the actual living area. But in those cases where it does find its way into the living area with any frequency, then we need to take steps to make sure that we can eliminate the bats. The seasons for remediation are really related to the biology of the bats. So in the spring, bats come out of their harbor, come out of their roosting site when the insects start flying. The only reason that bats are going outside is to catch some water and catch some insects, because they do eat considerable numbers of insects. So from that standpoint, bats are truly a beneficial animal. The number of insects that they eat is tremendous and can be very helpful. So the bats are going to be flying at that point up until about May and June. In June, late May and June, then they start to have their young, and at that time it's best to not exclude the bats from the house, because there may be young left behind, and those young are going to be in the house, and we exclude the adult bats, and we've still got young ones in the house. So that for that reason, from late May to first part of August, we don't do bat exclusions. We would probably tolerate them, maybe develop the plan of how we're going to exclude them, but we don't necessarily do the exclusion. After August, then we can start to do bat exclusions, which really means knowing where the bats are coming and leaving, coming and returning to the house at. We wait until they're out of the house and then seal up the openings. We don't have to do that in the middle of the night, though. The good thing is that we could exclude them by putting up a one-way valve in that area so that the bats can get away, but when they come back, they can't get back into the house because of some loose screening or something of that sort that we've hung over that opening. Once we're pretty sure that they've all exited the building, then we can go back in and seal up those openings and take care of the situation that way. That will work until about October, after the first frost. Then there's no more bugs flying around, so there's no reason for the bat to be out exerting energy when they aren't actually out consuming insects. And so when you get into October and there's no insects around, then we can really suspend any bat exclusion at that point. There are several companies that do work to exclude bats, and as I said or would mention, that's really a matter of maintaining the structure in good condition and taking some steps to eliminate any spots where creatures might be coming and going out of the structure. So with a little tune-up in that regard, you can avoid a lot of troubles with those kind of invaders. Some bats do migrate, and they will exit the area. Probably would come back again if that's how most of those creatures do. A certain number of them, though, find the attic area of a house to be pretty inviting because it's got enough residual heat that comes up there. So they'll stay in that house through the winter. Occasionally they'll move around some in the wintertime. On a nice day, they may find their way out to get water just to stay hydrated through the winter, but they're not going to be really active at that time. They might just shift around a little bit up in their area that they're hiding in. I think it's just good sense that if you encounter an animal that is a wild animal, and even some tame animals, if you don't know what their history is, it's probably a good idea to leave that animal alone. In most cases, those creatures that you might come across that look like they're sick, injured, or abandoned might just be temporarily misplaced. And if you leave them alone, they will probably find their way on to shelter, or depending upon the species or the type, they may find their way back to wherever their nest or wherever their home is without having human interference in there. So there are some small animals, skunks or whatever other kinds of small animals that you hear of people taking in for pets and those kind of things. Well, you're really dealing with nature, and those types of animals can also harbor diseases that you wouldn't necessarily want to come in contact with. So it's kind of best to leave those alone and just not risk the exposure. It's to make sure that they have their rabies vaccinations and that everything is up to speed, because if your dog or cat goes out and tangles with a creature that has rabies and it's not vaccinated, well, then you have to isolate your pet for the prescribed number of days just to make sure that it hasn't come down with rabies, or that it doesn't come down with rabies and exhibit the effects of having been in contact like that. A vaccinated animal is protected from those kinds of diseases, and that's very important to be responsible in that manner. I think the best spot in the place that I go to for my internet information is at the CDC.gov website. That's the Centers for Disease Control website at cdc.gov. They have a wealth of information there that is easily searched, and I find it to be very reliable. A lot of times the information on the state of Nebraska's website is also very good. If you query the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, for instance, for a particular program, it will also have good information, and in some cases that's linked directly back to the CDC website. So those would be my main suggestions and sources for information. If they call my office, we'll try to help out to make sure that we can answer those kinds of things. And if people have questions about their house and suggestion, or looking for suggestions on what you might do, we can try to offer assistance in those manners.